And thanks for joining us. We begin with the story about a torrid love affair and a mass murder involving famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright.
It happened 100 years ago at his sprawling estate that is now a popular tourist attraction.
Shannon Sims takes us to Taliesin near Spring Green.
Frank Lloyd Wright's masterful estate, Taliesin, is a thing of beauty.
He was very interested in location as a source for his architecture.
Built in a hillside, you almost feel like a part of nature.
The thing that makes it such an amazing location is primarily this sense of floating.
It's hard to believe that on this same site 100 years ago, one of the state's most grisly mass murders occurred.
It was the crime of the century, that's for sure, because it was 7 people killed in one spot in one day. Nobody really wanted to talk about it or think about it or remember it. They wanted to lose that history. And so I was interested in recovering that history.
Author Ron McCree has long been intrigued by Frank Lloyd Wright.
Frank Lloyd Wright is actually kind of heroic. He's constantly pushing against the grain of the dominant culture of American life and American values.
After years of research, Ron released his book, Building Taliesin, in 2012. It explores Wright's architectural work along with a scandalous personal life.
From all I've read, he was quite a charmer and a good time. He was a short guy and compensated for that, I think, with by making himself a larger than life in his personality and in his dress and other things with his capes and the lifts in his shoes and his canes.
Wright, who was married at the time, fell for Mamah Broderick Cheney, the wife of one of his clients. Before long, they were lovers.
They both wanted more. They wanted, maybe it was a midlife crisis, but they really fell in love.
Frank built Taliesin as a getaway for himself, Mamah, and her young children.
They were riding high.
That happiness was short-lived. House cook Julian Carlton murdered Mamah, her 2 children, and 4 other workers, and set the estate on fire.
His motive is still unknown. He seems to have become paranoid or feeling oppressed or picked on.
Despite medical attention, Carlton died in jail just a few weeks later, never revealing his motive. Some saw the murders as a sort of punishment for Frank and Mamah's adulterous relationship.
And of course, in the press and in the pulpit, these killings were treated as though this was divine justice, a divine retribution, that Julian Carlton was the avenging angel who smote the wicked.
Wright's Spring Green paradise was a distant memory.
It burned his house down and it destroyed, at that moment, the love of his life.
Sid Robinson takes us on a tour of Taliesin today, including the room where the murders happened.
That's where, in the past, was where Mamah and her 2 children were having lunch on August 15th, 1914.
As Sid points out, the design of the house is pure Frank Lloyd Wright.
The thing that Wright was always interested in was shelter. And so these sloped roofs and the lines on the ceilings all sort of knit together. He wanted to be part of the land. And I think that's one of the things that makes Taliesin so significant.
The courtyard shows this bond with the land.
This is sort of the heart of the complex. And you can see the stone retaining wall there that shows what Wright did was cut into the hill to make this flat area where we're standing. So it's like a terrace or a shelf that he surrounded the house by. And this is their cemetery.
Less than a mile from the home is Frank's family cemetery, including Mamah's grave. Sid sees it as a beautiful tribute to a life lost far too soon.
If you stand here and you can look up at Taliesin, it's poignant, not creepy.
While the story behind Taliesin may be tragic, Ron feels it could serve as a life lesson for us all.
How much life can be lived in a few years, and how quickly it can all be blown apart. This is the day of the fire and the day after the fire, and at this point, the children have been killed.
As a former newspaper editor, Ron is constantly trying to learn more about this intriguing man and the life he led.
He had to have a big ego, and he did have a big ego. I like to say he was the Muhammad Ali of architecture because he was always telling people that he was the greatest. And he knew that he was the greatest and was happy to tell you that he was.
And I want to give a little shout out to Paul Marble, our photojournalist who produced that fine piece. And worth noting that this estate was donated to the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation after his death in 1959.
It's now one of Wisconsin's most popular tourist attractions, as we all know.
Fascinating piece of history.
Excellent.
Well,